Okay, again, I'd like to welcome you all to our workshop series about incorporating geography into National Survey of Early Care and Education, or NSECE Analyses. Today is the first day of two 90-minute interactive workshop sessions, and we will be covering linking geography-based external data. My name is Vrinda Mahishi, and I am a data project manager for the Child and Family Data Archive. And I'm joined today by my colleagues from NORC. And before I turn the workshop over to them, I will briefly introduce you to the Child and Family Data Archive and let you know a bit about how to access the NSECE data that we have available there. So this workshop is hosted by the Child and Family Data Archive, also known as CF Data, which is where you go to access the NSECE Level 1 and public use data. CF Data is supported by a contract from the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, or OPRE, and housed at ICPSR within the University of Michigan. It is the place to discover, access, and analyze data on young children, their families and communities, and the programs that serve them. Users are able to access over 350 data sets, and some of those data sets have the ability to analyze select data sets online. You can also search and compare variables and peruse data-related publications. And of course, user support is available to assist you in finding and obtaining data. Our website is available at childandfamilydataarchive.org. And through the website, researchers, policymakers, and other users can explore data, learn more about childcare and early education research, and discover the training opportunities presented by CF Data. Before accessing the NSECE data, we encourage new users to first assess whether the data are relevant for your needs. Under the Support for Researchers tab, which has newly been named the Resources tab on our website, users can review the data training resources from the NSECE page, circled here in red. The first tab on this page gives an overview of the study, including a video on getting to know the 2019 NSECE. Then we have the second tab called The Data, which is a quick way to download the quick tabulation manuals and users guides to help you get familiar with the data sets available. And then once you have decided what files you will need for your analysis, you can click on the links to the 2019 or 2012 study homepages, which are available on the Data tab. For the 2019 NSECE, there are two study homepages, one for the public use data and one for the newly released Level 1 restricted use data. Here is a screenshot of the public use data study homepage, but they're both structured similarly. The public use data can be downloaded directly from the website after creating a free My Data account here, and the restricted use data, however, requires an application to access, but you can review the documentation without an application. More information on the application requirements can be found on the restricted use study homepage. The homepage is also where you will find important information, such as a summary about the study and information on the study's methodology, sampling, weights, and more. And then you can search and compare variables here and view publications that have used the 2019 NSECE data. We also have a collection of video resources, which you can find under the Resources tab. And here you will find many videos of data release webinars and their accompanying slides, as well as data trainings offered by data producers, including several past trainings about NSECE. And you can filter by a particular data set here and a video of portions of this workshop will be added to this page when available. So to find out more, we encourage you to visit the CF Data website, where you can also request access to these data. There, you can sign up for our listserv to receive notifications on new data release announcements, data webinars, and also sign up for our quarterly newsletter. And lastly, we encourage you, you can contact us at cfdata-help@umich.edu for any questions about accessing the data. And now I am very happy to turn the workshop over to the NSECE team.
Hi, I'm Rupa Datta. I am the principal investigator of the NSECE at NARC. And I am happy to be talking with you today with my colleague June Park, who will be speaking later, and with several of my colleagues who will be assisting in our small groups. So you will be spending a lot of your time during this session with one of my colleagues, Erin Hardy, Josh Borton, Lance Selva, or Claudia Zapata. We are all members of the NSECE team at NORC. The NSECE, as Brenda mentioned, is funded by the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation. Ivelisse Martinez-Beck and Ann Rivera are our co-project officers. And although NORC is the main contractor for the NSECE, we do have a number of organizational and independent research partners who are vital to the success of the NSECE.
Recording in progress.
Just to get us going, we do want this to be an interactive workshop. So I'm going to ask everyone to just drop into the chat a geographic unit of interest to you, as well as a few words about why it might be interesting to you. This subject is linkage of external data to the NSECE using geographic identifiers. So let's go ahead and talk about some of those levels that might be of interest to you. Okay, we're seeing things like states to identify state policy, childcare policies, the zip code, I forget what the T is in ZCTA, but the 3-digit zip code areas, census tracts as a proxy for neighborhood, again, state childcare policies, targeting geographic areas for preschool and childcare development, high density poverty census tracts, again, states, census tracts, provider clusters. That's a nice plug for our workshop tomorrow on the provider cluster. Counties is another available unit. Great, so these and others are possible units for linkage, and you all are doing a lot of the hard work of the session already with some of this thinking. Thank you. So what's our plan for today? We will introduce an approach that we have built over time in working with linkages to NSECE data that we find help us and others plan a linkage analysis. Then we'll talk a little bit about the specific geographic levels and how to pick measures when you're thinking about doing a linkage analysis with the NSECE on the external data side. We'll then move on to the NSECE side, and again, think about the analysis sample that you might want to choose, as well as the measures from the NSECE data that you might want. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about disclosure guidelines. Pretty much anything that you would do to implement the ideas that we talk about today, any kind of linkage analysis is likely to require what we call level 2 restricted use access. So Vrinda mentioned public use, and level 1 restricted use data are available from the CFDA archive. Level 2 restricted use data are further restricted, and all of the geographic identifiers, starting with state and down, are all available only in the level 2 environment. So we will be talking about what those disclosure guidelines are and how they might be relevant for your planning of your analysis. So when you are thinking about analyzing data that you would like to link to the NSECE, there are a variety of choices to be made. The flexibility of the NSECE data really means that for a huge swath of analyses, there are multiple possible ways one could undertake the analysis. There is rarely a single right way. What we're talking about today really is how to think through what some of the options might be and what the trade-offs might be, so that you can decide based on your particular needs what option would be best for you. And that might have to do with who your audience is, how much time you have to do the analysis. You might have specific policy or other goals. So 3 people undertaking the same research question might make very different choices about how to undertake the linkage and report their analyses. What we want to do today is really give you some tools for thinking through various options and easily identifying what some of the costs and benefits might be of those different options. We tend to do this by thinking about some choices that you'll want to make in planning your analysis, and then some considerations that might help you make those choices. On the left-hand side of the slide, you see the choices to be made. You'll start out by choosing an external data source, the non-NSECE data source, and the specific measures you might want to use from that data source. Then you'll want to think about the level of data linkage. We just talked about different geographic levels, census tracts, counties, states. You'll want to think about that level of linkage. And also, what then, having linked the data, what is the level at which you would like to analyze the linked data file? It is possible to link at one level and analyze at a different level. So you could link at the county level and then analyze at the household level, for example. Then we'll talk about the choices within the NSECE data for your analytic sample and the specific measures that you might want to use. And finally, the analytic strategies. Are you using a multivariate regression? Are you generating crosstabs? Those kinds of choices. Throughout all of these choices that you will likely need to make, we find that 4 considerations come up repeatedly and are useful in fleshing out the choices. And these considerations appear on the right-hand side of your slide. How much data will you actually have? What are the sample sizes? What kinds of data would be available? The second is about the data quality. Might you end up in your linked data set with a biased sample that is systematically missing certain types of subsamples? what kind of standard error or precision might you be looking at? Then we think about interpretation and relevance. Obviously, this is incredibly important. Sure, you might be able to do a linkage, but you want to make sure that it's meaningful and tells you something. And so how do we think about when you link at a certain level or use a certain measure, what will be the interpretation? How will you communicate? And how relevant is that for the particular information need you have? And then, as I mentioned, any of this work would need to be done in the level 2 restricted use environment. There are some disclosure guidelines that have to be abided by when you're working in that level 2 environment. And what we find is that taking those into account as early as possible in the analysis makes everything go much smoother and faster. And so we'll try to introduce how some of that might enter in. Okay. For the purpose of today's conversation, we are going to talk through an example research question frequently. We find that it's easier to imagine some of this with a concrete question in mind. So the question we've chosen for today is, what is the relationship between what households spend on housing and what they spend on childcare and early education? So you can imagine this is a question that would be very relevant to the NSECE. The NSECE actually has quite good data on childcare expenditures, but very little on housing or housing expense. And so in order to address this question, you would likely need to link in some external data on housing cost, and then you would use the NSECE childcare data. So we'll just talk through this. The choices and the considerations really apply to any research project you'll do. We'll come back to this particular example to help us with our conversation. You may have seen this diagram previously. It just shows our samples and the different surveys that are part of the NSECE. The point for today is that any of these data files can be linked using geographic identifiers. We're going to talk about the household survey today, but the household survey, the workforce survey, the home-based survey, the center-based survey, all of them are eligible for linked analyses. So let's talk about choosing a linkage level and a measure. When we're linking NSECE data and non-NSECE data, the linkage can be done at many different levels. Some of these were the ones that you all mentioned. We have state, we have commuting areas, counties, school districts, zip codes. You may have others in mind. The linkage level, so whichever of these you choose, does not have to be embedded in the NSECE sample design. You can pick whatever geographic unit you want for linkage. Sometimes that'll be dictated by how your external data are structured. When you get to the analysis and the use of the NSECE data, it's very important that you use the NSECE sample design as a guide so that you can generate representative estimates. But the linkage itself can be done at whatever level you want. And as long as the NSECE part of the analysis is uses an appropriate unit of geography, you'll still have representative estimates. Another thing that we want to think about are the choice of measure. So we've talked about using housing cost as an example. You could think about using just dollar values of housing cost as a measure if you had it available in external data set. As you can imagine, there are higher cost parts of the country and lower cost parts of the country, and it is likely that high cost in housing could be related to high cost in childcare just based on the local cost of living. So when you're choosing a measure from your external data, one of the things we want to think about is how well you'll be able to make comparisons across the country. And will it be meaningful to use a raw value, in which case you're kind of treating $100,000 in the Bay Area the same as $100,000 in rural Mississippi. Or you might think of other measures like a percentile within a local area, or dividing the housing cost by the household income to get like a cost burden. Those have the effect of kind of normalizing relative to something that might facilitate comparisons either across households or across geographic areas. And so again, we're going to go through these different considerations to think about how we might choose the linkage level, the linkage source, as well as the choice of measure. Oops, sorry. Okay, so let's do an example here. We're talking about housing cost. One potential data source wouldn't really be housing cost, but might be housing value. And many of you may be familiar with Zillow data, which gives, if you are familiar with Zillow.com, you can look up the estimated current market value of any address. So you could think like, oh, I'm going to link the Zillow housing data, housing value data with the NSECE. The NORC team has the addresses of the households. They can do that match for me. So now let's go through some of these issues of sample sizes, by data quality, relevance, and try this out. So in terms of sample sizes and data availability, the Zillow data tend to be great for single family homes, or even for any property that goes through a market transaction. So a condo in a multi-unit building might have available data, but a rental unit might not. So as you think about how much of your sample will actually link, often one of the problems in linkages is not everything links. And so you might find that if you tried to link the NSECE to Zillow data, a lot of the rental units, especially rental apartments, would not match. So that, first of all, is going to reduce your sample sizes because you will have fewer linked observations. Then the next consideration is data quality. And so we think about bias. And you might be concerned about doing an analysis where households living in apartments get sort of inadvertently left out of the analysis because you've only matched to households that are living in single family homes. So there, it's not just a sample size issue, but you might also have concerns that you'll end up with a biased sample in the linked data. It might be more advantaged. It might be from certain parts of the country where multi-unit dwellings are less common. On the other hand, the relevance, like if you actually could match everyone to their housing values, like that would be great. You're not aggregating, you're not using estimates, you're actually using each household's own housing value. So that might be a plus for an address level match. We could do something similar in thinking about a county level match, where now we would be aggregating up all of the Zillow data in a county, creating, say, an average or a median housing value for the county, and then linking that value to every household in the NSECE data. Here, the sample size problems go away because you'll probably always link to something in each county. The bias is, this is a more complex question. You might say that at least the linked value means kind of the same thing for everyone, and you're not missing out. You don't have to have no data for the apartment dwellers. But you could think further about what you actually think a county level housing measure means. And then on the relevance side, now you're not talking about the household's own value, but you're talking about the housing values in a community. So your analysis now moves from like households that pay more for housing, pay more or less for childcare, to a different question, which is households that live in areas with greater housing costs do this or that for housing. So this is the kind of exercise. You'll almost never know the actual answers at this stage. What you're doing is hypothesizing, thinking through the issues, generating a little checklist of what you could then investigate empirically. You could try to find other information that tells you whether or not these issues would be likely to be present if you went forward with a linkage. So we're going to try this exercise on a different data set of your choosing. So Brenda, I think we're going to magically send everyone to a small group. Each of you will be in a group with one of my NRC colleagues. We're going to spend 10 minutes and we'll talk through a very similar exercise in those groups. So please do your magic, Brenda.
Okay.
So does anyone want to share something from the conversation that occurred in your small groups, either aloud or in the chat? We talked about sample size a lot in our session, and particularly, well, and also that on the one hand, the higher level the unit, the county or state, you always have a value to link to, but the meaning of the measure may get more and more diluted, especially if the geographic area is heterogeneous. So linking a county level housing value may mean that you've got rural households in that county getting linked to a fairly high urban housing cost value, things like that. Any comments from the other groups? Were there questions that maybe the whole group would want to hear?
Our group considered the possibility of linking the provider clusters, and we chose the American Housing Survey. And then we thought that if the American Housing Survey has data at the census tract level, then it would be possible to choose the tracts from the American Housing Survey that are in a particular provider cluster, and it would be possible to do that link at that level. And we didn't finish our conversation, but we got as far as that.
Hey. Yes, and that compared to Zillow, which is housing values, the American Housing Survey data is actually housing costs. So it's closer to what we might have been interested in. Is there somebody else that wanted to share? Okay. I think at this point, I am turning things over to my colleague, Jean.
Thank you. So now let's talk about the choice of NSECE analysis level and measure. So we're going to continue with our example of housing cost and the childcare cost that we've been discussing in our first example. So when we think about the selection of level of analysis, there are different ways to analyze household data, NSECE household survey data. You could analyze you could analyze at the child level or household level, or tract level, or primary sampling unit, or county by aggregating household level data. Just wanted to quickly also highlight that the child level data is also available in the household survey. Similarly, you're also going to have to think about the NSECE analytic sample, and this is going to have an effect on the sample size as well as interpretation. So, for example, when you want to study the child care costs, the choice of your analytic sample can have a significant impact in the interpretation of the results that you will get. So NSECE household survey include household cost data from all children aged 0 to 13. But you might want to think a little bit about restricting the analytic sample to by age of the children. For example, are you interested in the childcare costs of children attending schools? Or are you interested in childcare costs of younger children? Are you interested in the childcare cost of, are you only interested in households that use any regular care? And in your analytic sample, are you going to include households that have non-zero cost burden? So these are the kind of questions that you want to ask yourself when you think about the NSECE analytic sample and the choice of measure. And another question to think about is the specific NSECE measure. So in our cost example, depending on how you construct the measure, it can also have impact in your results and how you interpret the results. So you could have like a household level, percent of households with any cost of regular CCEE, or you could also have more continuous variable of households out-of-pocket costs for regular CCEE. That's going to be a dollar amount. Another way to think about cost is to kind of use more of a standardized measure using the household income data. So you could construct a measure such as cost burden, which is percent of income paid out of percent of income that's in out-of-pocket costs. So that's going to standardize some of the variations of household income. So in summary, when you think about the NSECE analytics sample and the choice of measure, it's important to think about the 4 bullet points that we've been discussing previously. So the sample size consideration, data availability, data quality, interpretation, relevance, and the disclosure concerns. So just like the first breakout session, we are going to be split into the same small groups that we were in previously. And we are going to discuss advantage and disadvantage of approaching the example research question of linking housing costs to CCE costs with these 2 characteristics. So as a reminder, we are going to be, so in this example, we are going to think about household as a unit of analysis, and we are going to use the household out-of-pocket cost of regular CCEE as a measure of CCEE costs. So the household out-of-pocket cost is a continuous measure that's included in NSECE household survey that sums up all child-level arrangement costs of all children under the age of 13 to the household level and produces a weekly cost of the household that they pay out of pocket. So in your small group, think about these 2 level of analysis and the measure, and think about the advantage and also the disadvantage of using this. And I think we are going to be separated out into the small groups again, and we'll come back and share some of our discussions. So does anybody want to share some of the discussions from the small groups? Feel free to just put anything in the chat box or just feel free to share.
Hi, everyone. I could share a little bit. We chatted about the idea that focusing on the household might miss some of the more structural or community narratives that are likely at play when it comes to deciding about childcare arrangements and the access that people have. So I guess that would be maybe a disadvantage. And we talked about some idea, just to throw it out there, of like what a neighborhood measure of household out-of-pocket costs might look like. Like if we think it might be interesting if communities could be characterized based off of how much they collectively spend or something like that. But yeah, just that if you focus solely on the household, you might fall into this trap of thinking that the household needs to change how they're spending, or they need to, they're making bad decisions, when really a lot of these issues are bounded by larger systems. Thanks.
That's a good point. I think I'll just share one thing from the group that I thought was interesting also. We talked a lot about, I'm going to just share some of the comments that are coming up. Having household level CCE is a great advantage and gives a lot of flexibility. Yeah, so just going back to where I was a bit earlier, I thought we had a very fruitful discussion about the advantage and disadvantage. I think one thing that we agreed on was that there's always also like a trade-off of like, you could have like a household level data, and it may not be easy to link it to other like data sources, but you can also control for other household characteristics. That's like with using other household level variables that's within the NSECE data, which I thought was very interesting. So I think I'll now move on to the next topic, which is the disclosure guidelines. So in the framework of the level 2 data sets, we do have different disclosure guidelines, but the general principle is that you will be able to access a lot of data for your analysis. But most of the what we are going to put disclosure guideline is mostly the tables, regression results. That's going to be part of your journal article. So we have these basic disclosure guidelines, and we are also going to have the researcher work on this data secure environment to access the NSECE data and work on your analysis. And you're going to produce different tables, tabulations, or regression tables that are going to go through another level of disclosure review, and to extract the table. And we do impose these disclosure guidelines for external researchers accessing level 2 data set. And one of the big guideline that we put is that any reported estimate must have at least 3 areas of geography in population. So that is, if your analysis is at the national level, and you are going to have state level data, you're going to have, so if you're going to have like a national level analysis and your analytic sample are states that have like a universal pre-K, then you're going to have to include at least 3 states that fits the criteria, that fits the definition of your sample. So for example, another instance is where you're only analyzing a California data. We are going to have you at least 3 counties within the state of California who fit the definition. Rupa, did you have something to add on to this definition?
I was just going to note that it looks like Claudia has her hand raised. I don't know if there's a
Oh.
question from the group.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Rupa. Yeah, we had a question earlier, just clarifying the levels of geography available at the public versus level 1 versus level 2. This might be a good time to just do a refresh.
June, do you want me to answer that?
Yep. Rupa, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. So the public use data do not have any geographic identifiers other than the 4 census regions. They do have some linked ACS, American Community Survey data on poverty density and urbanicity and things like that. But in general, the public use data, other than the 4 census regions, there are no geographic identifiers. What is available to researchers in the level 2 environment is essentially anything. Some identifiers we would directly provide researchers, and they could, like state, use in your analyses and even report. As June is saying, in your dissertation or your journal article. Other things like counties may be directly available to researchers to use, but they can't be reported. And so what gets reported in a published document would have to be more aggregate. Even things like address or census tract, we would not make available directly to researchers, but if an analyst said, I want to link something at the address level, we would be happy to work with the researcher to make that linkage for them. And that kind of gets to the second point on this slide, which is that you can really request anything be linked at any level, but we would want to make sure that by virtue of that linkage, we hadn't disclosed too much geography about the sample unit. So we might ask if you had, say, very detailed school district level information about pre-K programs. We might be able to link that, but we might ask you to coarsen your source data file so that individual school districts can't be identified. So maybe you had a teacher to student ratio that has 3 decimal places, which makes some school districts uniquely identifiable. We might say, how about you round that to 1 decimal place so that no individual school district can be identified, and we'll link that at the provider level. So there are some things like that, but basically there are no linkage units that are off the table. It's a question of whether the researcher can do it directly or whether the NORC team would have to facilitate that linkage. And there are limits on what can be reported in publicly released documents, which are different from what researchers can work with within the remote environment.
Sure, but I am also saying one question from Sarah, actually. So when you say linked data cannot uniquely identify geographic areas below requested level of geography, which we just discussed about, does that include maps where there are layers of lower level of geography on top of a layer, including NSECE data? Sarah, do you want to briefly just quickly elaborate a little bit? Or we can kind of also connect later if this sounds like it's a lower level of geography that, but it's a map data, so it's
Yeah,
not
I
like
guess I'm just curious if like if it's linked directly, these rules apply, or if it's even if it's like on a visual where they're not like linked directly, but you can visually see something at a lower level in relation to it. Does that still apply?
I think I might just say like maps get challenging. They're not impossible. For example, you could certainly have a map of the US with the 50 states and have color coding to indicate the percentage of children in publicly funded care or something like that. So it's not that maps are always impossible. The important thing is that we have strict rules against identifying any sub-state location as being in the NSECE sample or not. So any map that would attempt to show sub-state locations, especially that have fewer than 3 counties, is off limits. So it gets a little complicated. We can refer you to the level 2 packet, which is available on the OPRE website and has more detail, and we're happy to always talk to folks. I'm mindful of the time, so I think that we should probably move on for now.
So we talked about the 2 main disclosure guidelines. There are also a few other things to think about. In addition to the requirements for the level 2 disclosure risk, we also have some rules on the cell size. We also have some rules on the rounding and the significant figures for the final tables that you will be taking out of the data secure environment. In general, frequencies or crosstabs, so relatively rare populations and or specific geographic units can sometimes have a pretty high disclosure risk depending on the cell size. So in these cases, readers might potentially re-identify using the raw data, which geography or which cases that you're talking about in your results. So we will review those pretty thoroughly. On the other hand, regressions or results from multivariate models are quite robust to disclosure risk. So it's really difficult to re-identify a geographic area based on your regression coefficient. So these are the 2 types of things that we see a lot, like frequency tables and regression results. So it's something to keep in mind when you are thinking about your analysis. So there are times when there are very small cell. So we might also ask for crosstabs to kind of group different geographic areas together to increase the cell size and limit the disclosure risk. So you might have some states, Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky. We might ask you to create a region variable to combine these data sets together. So those states are still named, but you might, based on other variables, that you might be able to identify cases or locations of certain states. So instead, we might combine them together or also create an index, like a composite measure, to get a better, to be an alternative option for reporting the analysis. And when you're aggregating observations, you might have a higher level of geographic unit, but you might also improve precision in your estimates. So that's also another thing to consider. So we're close to the we're close to the end. So just to kind of like summarize everything together in just one final slide about talking about the disclosure risk. We talked a lot about using housing costs and looking at the relationship between housing costs and CTE cost relationship. And you might have an analytic proposal, like analysis proposal, that's highly disclosive in your initial stage, but you may think about different options to reduce the disclosure risk and still be able to do your study. So like one option that you might have when you have initially thought about your analysis is to simply just report state level estimate, right? So some states have low sample size and this might require suppression. And when you just like have everything at the state level, you might not require suppression, but there might be some states with high standard errors in your estimate. And there are some populous states with substantial variation in housing costs. So just reporting everything at the state level may not be very useful for the readers. On the other hand, you might have a different approach where you create subgroups of PSUs. So for example, by housing costs or urbanicity or other features, you might be able to group certain units together and create subgroups. So, and it can be defined so that no groups of PSU will have a small sample size that's going to impose high disclosure risk. And the benefit of like thinking about different subgroups as a unit of analysis is that you can still be able to use all of your data in your all of your data in your estimate. So you're not suppressing anything. You're kind of combining and creating groups that you can actually report. And sometimes like these estimates can be a lot more informative than just having an estimate with high standard errors. So this was a final example of like two options, different approaches that you can take. So I'm gonna pass this again to Rupa for the final wrap up.
Yeah, so I think what we'd like you to leave today with is an understanding that almost any analysis can be done in a variety of ways in the NSECE. And so there are a lot of choices to be made. It's likely that there is no uniformly best solution, but rather, given your needs, your resources, your interests, you may find that some solutions are better than others. And so we encourage you to really take some time in that planning and thinking through process. We talked about these different choices. Not just what data source, but how would you construct the measure from that external data source? What level would you link the external data source with the NSECE data source? And then what level will you do the analysis? Then there are choices on the analysis sample size and the NSECE data that can have huge differences in sample sizes and interpretability. And then finally, the analytic strategies you use, not only are there, of course, methodological reasons and interpretation reasons to favor one or another analytic strategy, but also the disclosure guidelines may require you to go back and rethink how you'd like to report something. I want to emphasize from Jiyoon's points just now that we've had close to 300 researchers at this point use level 2 data. So we have a good amount of experience. I don't know that we've ever had to turn someone away because they couldn't figure out a way to abide by the disclosure guidelines. There are people for whom the sample sizes are inadequate, but more commonly, the research is feasible, but maybe the initial idea of how to report analyses bumped up against the disclosure guidelines. And so the researcher needed to rethink so that more of the analyses could be shared publicly, or the estimates were more robust through some respecification of the analytic strategy. And these 4 fact considerations, the sample sizes and data availability, the quality of the data, how would you interpret the analyses, and how are you going to accommodate the disclosure concerns? These are all useful questions to ask yourself at each stage, so that you can make choices that will best meet your needs. In the group that I was in, we kept coming back to, well, it really depends on what the research question is and what particular mechanisms or levers are you interested in exploring. And we want to emphasize that the NSEC data has a lot of flexibility, and as a result, you have a lot of choices in how you specify your analyses. It's thinking through some of those options as a first step to planning your analyses is almost always more satisfying for the researcher than maybe just coming in laser focused with one idea of how you'll want to do the work, because we find in those situations more often people end up maybe respecifying and having to take a few steps back once they've taken into account some of these considerations and some alternative ways that they might specify their analysis. The data are flexible, and also the NSEC team is available to help you think through your analyses. We frequently, June actually, among others on this call from the NARC team, frequently meet with researchers who are thinking about using the NSEC data for linkages to help them think through some of the options and some of the trade-offs. I just wanted to remind folks that we are having a second workshop tomorrow on defining communities in the NSEC, which will take us particular focus on the provider cluster. I think we are done for today, just in time. We encourage people to reach out at this nsec@norc.org email address in follow-up today's workshop, as well as at any other time, if you have questions about the NSEC data and how to best use them for your analyses. Thank you so much for joining.